It was a Wednesday afternoon in the spring of 1993, and Michael Jordan was moving through downtown Chicago with the particular invisibility that his security team had spent years constructing out of necessity. The Bulls were 3 weeks away from the end of a regular season that would lead to their third consecutive championship run, and Jordan was in the middle of the compressed and demanding schedule that the final stretch of an NBA season imposes on its participants. Practice in the mornings, games every other night, the physical and mental maintenance required to sustain elite performance across a season that had been running since October. He had a 2-hour window between his morning obligations and an afternoon commitment that his schedule did not often produce, and he was using it the way he used most unstructured time, moving, thinking, occupying space without the specific purpose that structured time demanded. He was on foot, which was unusual enough in his circumstances that it required deliberate arrangement. His security lead at the time, a man named Curtis who had been with Jordan for 4 years and understood the particular logistics of protecting someone whose face was the most recognizable in American sport, had identified a route through a neighborhood on the western edge of downtown where foot traffic was light enough and the population familiar enough with the presence of famous people in Chicago not to generate the kind of immediate crowd formation that Jordan's appearance in more central locations tended to produce within minutes. It was not perfect invisibility. It was the best approximation available, and Jordan had learned to work within its limitations because the alternative was never walking through a city at all, which was a confinement he refused to accept completely. He saw the boy from approximately 30 feet away. The boy was perhaps 11 years old, small for his age, in the way that makes children look simultaneously younger and more serious than they are, standing at the edge of the sidewalk beside a folding table that was too large for him and that he had clearly not set up himself, the legs uneven on the pavement in a way that suggested adult assembly and child management. On the table were arranged boxes of candy bars, the kind sold in bulk for fundraising purposes, each one priced at $1, according to the hand-lettered sign that the boy had positioned at the front of the table with the careful attention to presentation of someone who understands that presentation is doing real work in his situation. Beside the price sign was a second sign, also hand-lettered, in the larger and less controlled handwriting of a child who has written something that matters to him and is trying to make sure it is read correctly. Jordan slowed without fully stopping, reading the second sign from the distance that still allowed him to look like someone who happened to be passing rather than someone who had specifically paused. The sign said that the money was for his mother's surgery. It said it simply, without elaboration, without the narrative context that an adult might have provided, because the boy had understood with the directness of children that the essential information was the essential information and that additional words did not add to it but only surrounded it. Mother. Surgery. The candy costs $1. That was what the sign said, and it was enough. Curtis had noticed Jordan slow and had positioned himself with the practiced discretion of someone who has learned to be present without being intrusive, close enough to respond to whatever developed without being close enough to define the situation before it defined itself. He watched Jordan stand on the sidewalk, looking at the boy and the table for a moment that lasted longer than casual observation, and he recognized in Jordan's stillness the quality of attention that meant something had registered in a way that was going to produce action rather than simply passing thought. The boy had seen Jordan by this point. The recognition happened in the specific sequence that recognition of someone enormously famous happens in public. First, the processing of a face that matches a face stored at an unusual level of cultural prominence. Then the cognitive resistance that tells you the match is probably wrong because the person you are matching to is not the kind of person who walks down this street on a Wednesday afternoon. And then the override of that resistance when the evidence of your eyes becomes impossible to dismiss. The boy went through all 3 stages in approximately 4 seconds and arrived at the end of them, standing very still behind his table with an expression that Jordan had seen on many children's faces across his career, and that he had always found more moving than the adult versions of the same expression. Because children had not yet learned to moderate the visibility of their internal states, and what showed on their faces showed completely. Jordan walked to the table. He did not approach with any announcement of intention or with the kind of visible generosity performance that the situation might have invited, from someone whose relationship with public gestures was less complicated. He walked to the table the way you walk to a table when you want to know what is being sold, and he looked at the candy bars with the mild interest of a person considering a purchase, and he said hello to the boy in the tone of someone greeting a person rather than addressing a child. The boy said hello back. His voice was steady in a way that suggested he had been at the table long enough to have spoken to a number of people and had developed a working composure for the experience, but the composure had limits, and talking to Michael Jordan was clearly outside them, because his voice, though steady, was operating at a slightly higher register than normal, and his eyes had the quality of someone trying very hard to behave normally while experiencing something that normal behavior was not fully equipped for. Jordan asked him about the surgery. He asked it directly, not with the tentative delicacy of someone worried about intruding, but with the straightforward interest of someone who has read a sign that invites a question and is asking the question the sign invites. The boy's name was Marcus. His mother's name was Gloria. She had been diagnosed 3 months earlier with a condition requiring surgery that their insurance did not fully cover, and that had produced a gap between what was available and what was needed, that the family had been trying to close through every means Marcus could think of and his mother would allow. He had been selling candy for 6 weeks. He came to this corner after school on weekdays and on Saturday mornings. He had raised, by his count, $237. Jordan listened to this account without interrupting, and without the expressions of performed sympathy that people sometimes deploy in these conversations to signal their emotional engagement before they have actually engaged. He listened the way people listen when they are actually listening, with his attention on Marcus rather than on his own response to what Marcus was saying, and when Marcus finished, he asked 2 questions. He asked how much the surgery cost in total, and he asked how much longer Marcus's mother could wait before the surgery became urgent. Marcus knew the answer to the first question precisely, because it was the number his entire project was organized around. He was less certain about the second, but he said what he had heard his mother and the doctors say, which was that sooner was significantly better than later, and that later carried risks that sooner did not. What happened next happened without theater. That was the quality of it that everyone who later heard the account from Marcus or from Curtis emphasized, that there was no performance in it, no arrangement of the moment for external effect, no pause designed to let the significance of what was about to happen accumulate into something that could be witnessed and appreciated. Jordan reached into his jacket, removed his wallet, and took from it the cash he had there, which Curtis later estimated at somewhere between $500 and $600. He put it on the table beside the candy bars. Then he told Marcus that he needed to talk to someone on his team and that Marcus should stay at the table, and he would be back. He walked 15 feet to where Curtis was standing and had a brief conversation that Curtis described as the most efficient conversation he had witnessed Jordan have about anything that was not basketball. Jordan told him what the surgery cost and what the timeline was and asked him to make 2 calls. The first call was to Jordan's personal assistant to arrange a transfer of funds sufficient to cover the gap between what insurance would pay and what the surgery cost, to be coordinated with whatever administrative information Marcus's family could provide. The second call was to a contact at Northwestern Memorial Hospital to identify the right specialist for Gloria's condition and to ensure that the appointment could be arranged quickly rather than through the normal waiting processes that made the timeline problem worse rather than better. Curtis made the calls. He made them standing on the sidewalk, while Jordan walked back to Marcus's table and bought a candy bar, paying for it with the correct amount from a different pocket, and eating it with the straightforward pleasure of someone who likes candy bars and has just bought one, which Jordan did and had. Marcus watched this with the expression of someone who is trying to determine whether what has just happened is what it appears to be, because what it appeared to be was so far outside the expected parameters of a Wednesday afternoon at a folding table that accepting it as real required a recalibration of what real meant. Jordan finished the candy bar and told Marcus what had been arranged. He told him not in the emotional register that the situation might have seemed to warrant, but in the practical register of someone communicating logistics, the same way he had told Curtis what calls to make. He said the money for the surgery would be handled. He said someone would contact his family to coordinate the details. He said the Dr. Curtis had reached out to was the right person for his mother's situation, and that the appointment would be arranged faster than the normal process would allow. He said Marcus should take the rest of his candy home because he didn't need to stand on the corner anymore. Marcus was 11 years old, and he processed this information with the combination of immediate comprehension and delayed emotional response that significant news tends to produce in people who are not yet practiced at receiving it. He understood what had been said. The implications of what had been said arrived slightly after the words did. When they arrived, he sat down on the folding chair behind his table, because sitting down was what his body decided to do, and he looked at Jordan with an expression that Curtis, watching from 15 feet away, later described as the most direct and uncomplicated expression of something real that he had seen on anyone's face. In years of working in a context where expressions were frequently managed for effect, Jordan looked at him for a moment and then said something that Marcus remembered with complete precision in the years afterward, because it was the kind of thing that lands in the specific register where memory stores things permanently. He said that what Marcus had done for his mother, the 6 weeks at the table, the $237, the hand-lettered sign, the willingness to stand on a sidewalk and ask strangers to help, was something that most adults could not do. He said it was not a small thing. He said the money was not a gift from him to Marcus's mother. It was a contribution to something Marcus had already started, and Marcus had done the harder part, which was starting it. Then he told Marcus to make sure his mother went to the doctor appointment when it was scheduled, said goodbye, and walked back to where Curtis was waiting. They continued down the sidewalk. Jordan ate a second candy bar that he had bought from the table when Marcus wasn't watching, and Curtis saw him do it, but said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Gloria had her surgery 6 weeks later. The specialist Jordan's contact had connected them with was, according to the surgical team that performed the procedure, the correct choice for her specific condition, a detail that mattered because the correct specialist for a given condition produces outcomes that a generalist cannot reliably replicate. The surgery went well. The recovery was what the doctors had projected when the surgery happened, within the timeline they had recommended, which it did, which meant the risks that later timing carried were not risks that Gloria faced. Marcus told the story of the Wednesday afternoon on the sidewalk for the rest of his life, in the way that people tell stories that happen to them before they are old enough to understand their full significance and that grow in meaning as they grow in the understanding required to appreciate them. He told it to friends and eventually to his own children, and the version he told his children included details that the version he told as an 11-year-old did not include, because the 11-year-old version was the version of someone who had experienced it, and the adult version was the version of someone who had spent decades thinking about what it meant. What it meant, in the version he had arrived at by the time he was telling it to his children, was several things simultaneously. It meant that the gap between what famous people appear to be from a distance and what they actually are up close is not always the gap that experience leads you to expect, that proximity sometimes confirms rather than complicates the impression that distance creates. It meant that help given without performance is a different thing from help given with it, that the absence of theater around a generous act is not a neutral quality, but a positive one that changes the nature of what is being given. And it meant something about his mother, about the 6 weeks he had spent at the table before that Wednesday afternoon, about what it meant that a man who did not know them and owed them nothing had looked at those 6 weeks and called them the harder part. Gloria lived for 23 more years after the surgery. She watched Marcus graduate from high school and then from college, the first in their family to do so. And she watched him build a life that had the stability and the forward motion that the surgery had made possible by being performed at the right time, by the right doctor, on a woman whose son had stood at a folding table for 6 weeks and refused to accept that the gap between what was needed and what was available was a gap that had to remain uncrossed. Jordan never spoke publicly about the Wednesday afternoon. Marcus never contacted him to tell him what had happened after. The story lived in the private space where it had occurred, passed forward through the family it had affected, growing in meaning as it traveled, carrying everything that had been given on a sidewalk in downtown Chicago on a spring afternoon when a man with 2 hours of unstructured time decided to use them in the only way that the situation, once seen clearly, made possible.